Hey everyone, welcome back to Even Tacos Fall Apart. I'm MommaFoxFire, and I'm so glad you're here for another mental health conversation. This week's episode was recorded back in 2021, and while some things may have changed since then, the conversation remains just as relevant and powerful today. I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Allison Battles, a clinical psychologist who works with veterans at the Minneapolis VA. We're talking about trauma recovery, growth, and what it means to expand your perspective when it comes to healing. Now, I want to be real with you here. This isn't a topic with easy answers. Trauma affects so many of us, whether it's something we've lived through ourselves or experienced through someone close to us. It can feel overwhelming, confusing, and downright exhausting to navigate. And while there's no magical solution, there are ways to move forward. In this episode, Allison shares her professional expertise and some really down-to-earth insights about what trauma recovery can look like. She talks about the different ways people process trauma, why healing isn't a one-size-fits-all journey, and how hope plays a huge role in the process. You'll also hear about the barriers that people face, whether it's internal struggles or external systems that make recovery harder, and how important it is to have the right support. This conversation is raw, honest, and full of practical wisdom. Allison isn't afraid to talk about the hard stuff, but she also brings a lot of hope to the table. If you've ever felt stuck in your trauma, if you've wondered whether healing is possible, or if you're just curious about how professionals approach this kind of work, this conversation has something for you. And I know I always say this, but it's worth repeating. This space is for connection. I want you to feel seen, heard, and supported when you listen to this podcast. If something resonates with you, share it, leave a comment, send me a message, or connect with me on social media. Your voice matters here. Before we jump into the interview, just a quick reminder that while we're talking about trauma recovery, it's okay if parts of this conversation feel heavy. Take care of yourself as you listen. Pause if you need to, grab some water, or come back to it later. Your well-being always comes first. All right, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Dr. Allison Battles. Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Mental Health Monday. I'm here with a fabulous guest. Dr. Allison Battles is here, and really excited to be talking to her tonight about trauma recovery and expanding perspectives on different avenues of growth. We've got some great things lined up to talk about. As always, there is a question queue open. If you have a question, exclamation point, the letter Q, type your question, hit enter, it'll put it in there, or just type it into the chat. That's fine too. I'll pick it up and we'll address it. Couple of disclaimers here at the very beginning. Remember that I, as it says up there, am not a professional mental health worker. Also, this is not a diagnosing forum, so we can't diagnose. We won't diagnose. We're not going to talk about your specific diagnosis, but we're happy to talk about things in general. And in addition, because tonight's topic is trauma related, and a lot of those things can be very triggering, we also would like to ask that you don't share very personal experiences of your own with trauma. And instead, if you have questions generally about trauma and recovery, that's fine, but don't share anything really specific. And I will also introduce Dr. Allison Battles here. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the Virginia Consortium in 2020 and is currently the psychology postdoctoral fellow with the trauma team at the Minneapolis VA healthcare system. Her clinical work focuses on helping people who are experiencing complex co-occurring trauma symptoms, serious mental illness, and substance abuse. She is engaged in research, with most of her work focusing on investigating the development and effects of PTSD and moral injury. Dr. Battles also works on enhancing existing evidence-based practices with a current emphasis on integrating geek content and culture into the therapeutic environment. She created and continues to run a therapeutic D&D group for veterans. So I've got some links here for you. I got her Twitter page. And also, if you are interested in any of her content, she was a presenter at the TAG Summit as well. So you can check out, if you get a media pass, you can check out her content there too. So thank you, Allison, so much for being here today with us.
Thank you for having me. I am thrilled to be here today.
And I know you had one more disclaimer. Did you want to go ahead and give that
Oh,
too?
yes. The good old I love my job with the federal government. Please don't fire me. Yes, so all of these opinions are my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or stance of the federal government or the Department of Veteran Affairs or the Department of Defense.
Yes, perfect. Coyote, hello. How are you today? Welcome on in. Switchy Twitcher, hey, how's it going? Good to see you. Hey, Slay. Adrian, oh, I've missed you so much. You should have gone to Mexico with me. Slay, I hope. Oh, Slay's excited about D&D. Angel, hey, how are you? Okay, so we're gonna dive right in here. Easy opener. Can you tell us a little more about your experiences and what made you become interested in specializing in mental health? Kind of why you do what you do?
Exactly. Yes, most certainly. So I myself am a psychology postdoctoral fellow. So what that means is I am at the very, very end of my graduate career, and I'm actually thrilled to say live to other people, I landed a job. So I will actually be staying on at the Minneapolis VA as a staff psychologist in the upcoming months. For me, there's actually like a running joke in our family that I am like a cliche apple never didn't fall far from the tree. My father served in the U.S. Air Force for 25 years, and my mom is a licensed clinical social worker. So my emphasis on veteran mental health is a bit of a product of both of them. For me, it's one of my earliest memories of my mom is her talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I just have such vivid memories of my mom when she was in school, like teaching me all of these psychology theories, all of these, mental health terminologies. And actually, when I went to graduate school, she bequeathed unto me her old diagnostic manual. And I actually hold on to it. It's a very, sentimental gift for me. So for myself, there was a lot of family influence and me being interested in the field of mental health. But truthfully, initially, early on, I actually was originally going into, believe it or not, politics. But I ended up working in politics for a period of time and really became quite disillusioned with the experience and ended up feeling as though my efforts in that regard were not as beneficial as I wanted them to be. I did not feel like I was having the impact on people that I wanted to in my life and in my career. And so, kind of with that, went back to school and ended up kind of picking up a degree in psychology. And from there, was fortunate to get to work at the Durham VA down in Durham, North Carolina. And that was some of my first exposure to some real psychology work where I was a lab manager for a multi-site research study, specifically looking at mental health of post 9/11 veterans. And so that was where I was really able to start to get exposed to kind of the myriad of concerns that veterans were facing, and also just kind of the myriad of concerns facing human beings in regard to mental health. And, through that work, I was also able to do some volunteer work at a domestic violence shelter, as well as served as a call responder on one of the VA national call lines. And so there was a lot of different experiences over kind of the course of a couple years that really opened my eyes to the fact that I wanted to be in this field and also that I wanted to have a more hands-on role in being able to have direct impacts potentially on helping individuals, on helping also larger groups of people with, obtaining the mental health and the recovery that they may be seeking. And so for myself and getting into kind of more trauma-based work, a lot of that really came out of my work at the Durham VA and truly just getting to work with veterans and hear their stories of what they went through, but also what they were facing now that they had transitioned out of the military. They were trying to find a way to integrate back into civilian life and how difficult that was for people. And so really hearing about a lot of these experiences, being able to have more of that hands-on role just ignited my soul. And I wanted to go into mental health and specifically psychology, so I really could have the ability to be able to address mental health concerns across the gambit.
Yeah, I mean that's a started when you were early and just kind of
It
carried
really
through.
did.
Yeah. I think we're all disillusioned with politics and politicians right now. So
I,
definitely don't blame me for that at all.
yeah, never once have regretted that career switch. Never once.
Good, good. So what's your favorite thing about working in the mental health field, and what have you found so far to be kind of the biggest challenge?
Oh, I would say, working in the mental health field, there are some incredibly rewarding things. I think for me, one of the biggest things is whenever there is that aha moment, whenever something clicks for someone, where there is a realization of something deeper within themselves, a connection between things that somebody maybe hadn't looked at before. And it allows for pieces of this puzzle to be able to fall together in a way that folks were able to make meaning, to be able to find actualization from. I actually was wrapping up with a client today, and she mentioned how she trusted herself again. And that just brought tears to my eyes because it was such a glorious moment to hear somebody who had experienced truly some horrific trauma come to a place where she trusted herself to make those decisions in her life, to be, in tune enough with herself to know her life direction of how she wanted to proceed forward. That is, I think, the greatest gift, I myself as a mental health provider can ever receive, is to see that change, that actual recovery take place in somebody. It is honestly what keeps me going in this field and in this career, because it is unlike any other experience to get to see another human being get in touch with themselves, develop comfort with themselves, and then from there feel empowered to do something. Um, it keeps me coming back each day to my job. So I think on the side of what are some of the greatest challenges, and there are definitely quite a few, I would say, I think one of the hard ones that I have noticed, especially kind of over the past couple months, is more in the sense of those times whenever, I will hear from clients that anxiety, that worry that I don't care for them, that this is just a part of my job. And the thing is, where, yes, there is a reality that this is the nature of my job, but I care so deeply for each and
Hmm.
every one of my clients. Each and every one of their stories, their lives is imprinted on my heart, and I take them with me. And I find that to be one of the more challenging aspects, in the sense of, I think the human being on the other side of the chair in the therapist can sometimes be lost. And for some therapists, they also try and keep that quite hidden. But I think that can be one of those challenges, in the sense of clients feeling you truly being there with them as just another genuine human being real with them. And also at the same time, whenever you hear that pushback for them or that anxiety from them, that care, that honesty is not genuine and actually there. I find
Hmm.
that to be a hard dynamic, in the sense of, just for me as a human being, just wanting to be there because that's something I want to stand for in my life. And so I find that to be a challenge that I don't think many providers often talk about in mental health, about how that dynamic can come up. Um, I think another challenge that can come in play is just having to, help people navigate and deal with literal systemic level injustices, systemic level power differentials. And especially as I think about just work as an individual therapist, I get to work with this one individual, but I have no power on the system in which they are operating in. Though I want to rail against that system
Hmm.
so hard, so often, I find that to be one of those points where you feel like your hands are tied to a degree, in the sense of just what each and every one of us actually have agency and power over. And so I find that that challenge is also a place that can be really profound growth, in the sense of allowing people that space to be able to honestly acknowledge injustices, prejudice, discrimination that has taken place in their life, and to do so in a space where they feel safe and they feel heard and they feel validated, and being seen for their true self, and being able to process that type of trauma truthfully and how they are experiencing the world.
Yeah. Switchy Twitcher said to get hope again for life, and I think that was relating to
Yeah.
kind of that first part of that was the part about kind of realizing, hey, I trust myself again.
Mhm.
I'm achieving something here in therapy.
Yeah.
That's definitely a big moment.
Hmm.
And
I love
hopefully it's multiple moments too, right?
Yes, very much so. And it's such an incremental journey, and it comes forth in so many different phases, so many different, shapes and forms that it can take place. And it's interesting that say hope, hope for life, because that honestly makes me think of a quote by the immortal Uncle Iroh from Avatar: The Last Airbender, that hope is something we give ourselves. That is the meaning of inner strength. That quote stays with me forever. And it's one that I strive to embody in my own self and my own personal growth experiences, but also it's one that I really strive to stand for just in how I am as a clinician in the room with people. Because I believe in hope. And I believe in purpose and meaning that we can draw from even the hardest experiences in our lives. So I really resonate with that comment.
Yep, we get a lot of really good comments in chat a lot of the time, and I'm grateful for them. So, what are some of your favorite hobbies, and do you feel that there are any distinctions between what you consider hobbies and what you consider self-care? Coyote, I see you. Thank you so much.
Um, so yeah, so there are a lot of different hobbies that I find myself partaking in. For myself in terms of just, things that I consider both that bridge of hobby and self-care. You know what? I actually want to address that hobby versus self-care thing
Mhm.
first before I dive on into my own preferences. Because I really do feel as though any hobby that we have can be utilized as a self-care technique. But it's also the way in which we are engaging in that activity, because any activity can be on a spectrum of what may be healthy versus unhealthy. And this, I think, is a huge debate that is coming up, especially around gaming in general, of what is healthy versus unhealthy gaming. And so I think in the sense of realms of self-care is more in a place that it is like that balanced level of engagement with it. We are spending time with it, but not to the detriment of our other responsibilities, not to the detriment of, our relationships and our lives. And we are utilizing it in a way where we are actively, intentionally engaging in it. We are present with that experience. We are mindful of how we are, participating in it. And I think that takes on that realm of self-care more than just, for myself, haphazardly binge watching Downton Abbey for 6 hours. So, which was my weekend. But, so it's one where I think there is kind of those varying degrees of what is self-care versus what is maybe just a hobby. Because there are definitely activities where I enjoy doing them, but I won't necessarily say I feel de-stressed. I am a young, new gardener, and by new, I mean I created my first terrarium in February. Half of the plants are still alive. I have a couple new additions. All of the rest are still alive, but gardening also gives me tremendous amounts of anxiety because I have no idea what I'm doing just yet. I just kind of wish that my grandmother would speak from beyond the grave to impart her green thumb wisdom to me. But I never acquired such necromantic abilities, so I'll have to put that one on the down low. Uh, but there is, whereas for me, baking is a huge self-care thing. I have been doing it, oh Lord, since middle school, which is longer than I want to admit how it was ago. So it was a long time ago that I started picking up baking. So for me, just pulling out ingredients, whipping to up a loaf of bread is second nature. It is relaxing. The actual kneading of the dough is such a mindfulness exercise for my own self of just feeling the sensation of the dough. What is it like for me to be rolling it out? And so for that, because I feel so comfortable with it, it now has taken on that element of self-care, whereas previously baking used to stress me out just like gardening does now. So there are, I think, a lot of different ways that hobbies can be both self-care and that there also have to be mindful of just how we are engaging in those experiences. I know, like, especially for my own self of gaming, There has definitely been times where the entire day has been spent on Skyrim, and that has been
Hmm.
tremendously rewarding, where I feel accomplished. I feel like I am the Dovahkiin. And and that is wonderful because I feel energized, actualized, and it's fantastic. Whereas there are also times where, you're playing a game and you reach a level of frustration. I've played Dark Souls once and learned that that is not the game for me and never will be. My frustration tolerance is not to that degree. But games like Celeste, where it is a phenomenal game, but also an incredibly challenging platformer. So I recognize, so for that one, it's one of, it is self-care until it reaches a threshold where I feel myself losing the enjoyment, losing the benefit, and moving into that place of just anger and irritation, and also oftentimes self-deprecation. And if I move into that realm, well, I know I'm not in that self-care anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those things, especially with gaming. I don't consider gaming necessarily self-care, but honestly, like I do consider streaming to be self-care. And it's one of those things where I come out of a stream really energized. I love interacting with people. I love doing these kinds of things where I get to talk to different people. It's fantastic. I don't necessarily consider gaming to be self-care because I play games like DBD where I get really mad.
And there are definitely times where, that spectrum of emotion needs to have its place to be
Hmm.
able to come out. But it is, I think what you just hit on, that energized,
Hmm.
that is where I think you're tapping into self-care and you're
Yeah.
tapping into something beneficial. Because a lot of times in mental health, we are focused so much on that problem narrative.
Yeah.
What are the symptoms you're experiencing? How long have you been experiencing this? How has this impacted your functioning? And all of these are incredibly relevant, but what we oftentimes lose sight of is the other side of the human being,
Hmm.
of those moments of lightness and excitement, things that actually get us activated in our lives. That was actually a huge motivator for me in getting into the whole integration of play and gaming and geek content and culture into mental health in general, was seeing the difference that it makes in those moments of lightness, in those moments of excitement for folks, and just how profound that growth truly can be, that we don't
Hmm.
always have to be talking about, just the problem that folks are experiencing, but we can diversify that conversation to allow for it to feel more balanced. Because I don't know about you, but definitely kind of those times of like, walking into a therapy room, sitting down, you're like, all right, well, I guess we're going to have it out again, aren't we? It gets exhausting
Yeah.
sometimes to go into therapy, each week knowing that that's the conversation. And
Yeah.
so I think those ways to shake it up, those ways to integrate those moments of lightness can just be so profound for our own growth and recovery.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I've definitely had those. Actually, today was one of those moments where we're still meeting via Zoom with my therapist,
Hmm.
and it was like she was like, "Do you have the energy to go here today?" I was like, "We can
Right?
tiptoe. We can tiptoe. Let's
Hmm.
tiptoe there. We
Yeah.
just covered some other shit. Let's tiptoe over here for a second."
Exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
and that's just so important to check in that sense
Hmm.
of like, where are we in any given day?
Yeah.
And also I think in a way allowing ourselves the space and the grace to be
Hmm.
okay with where we are in that day. Not every day has to be going up that steep, tallest mountain path. Some days we can take that low path, and that is still moving us forward.
I love that, the space and the grace. That's beautiful. So Switchy says, is it mostly vets that you treat or also people with childhood trauma?
Great question. So at the VA, I do treat all veterans. However, not all of them are military related trauma. I work with folks who have experienced kind of the gambit of traumas, whether that is, childhood-based traumas, combat-based trauma, military-based trauma, sexual traumas outside of the military context, natural disasters, race-based trauma. There are numerous types of trauma that I have, worked with, kind of in my current setting, but also just kind of across my, I can't say career because it is technically like graduate training, but I guess, 8 years of doing graduate training makes a career. So yeah, career.
Yeah. Slay said, someone get Frost in here so he can totally relate with Dark Souls being frustrating. Yes, he would relate. He would relate with that Most definitely. Brian, good to see you. Coyote said gaming distracts me from the nagging trauma thoughts and flashbacks. Yep. And then Switchy also asked, since you work with trauma clients, have you seen many with a dissociative disorder?
Excellent question. I was actually just discussing dissociative disorder last night, actually, after watching an episode of Star Trek Voyager. So it is interesting in the sense that I have never had the opportunity to treat a full like dissociative identity disorder. I have worked with folks who are experiencing dissociative symptoms in like kind of along the lines with trauma-based symptoms. So I have worked with folks who have experienced things in that realm where there is this derealization, depersonalization of kind of the reality or the experience that they are in. I also have worked with quite a few folks, and this is kind of another area of emphasis for myself, folks with serious mental illness. So folks who are experiencing schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And so with that, a large part of it is various forms of kind of delusional thought content, as well as various forms of hallucinations as well.
So we've kind of talked around this a little bit, but do you have a favorite game or genre of games?
Oh, so in my heart of hearts, I am an RPG girl. Give me a good storyline where I can be the hero of the world, and I am happy as can be. In terms of favorite game, I love Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, especially for me with my emphasis on serious mental illness and psychosis. Like, that is an incredible game. Like, they consulted with psychologists. They brought people onto the team to make sure that the representation of these hallucinations were realistic and actually in line with real experiences of folks who were experiencing this in their lives. It is one where I actually showed it to several members of our serious mental illness team, and I have kind of converted several people into gaming because of this game, because it is a remarkably well done, well told story. It is also scary as all get out in certain capacities. I can't remember the name of the level, but the one where it's like all dark and you're having to like avoid these creatures in the dark. Had a bit of a panic attack and had to pass that off to my partner to take over. But it's an incredible game, and I am so pumped that there's another one coming out in the not too distant future. So I adore that game. I'm also a sucker just for my good old classic RPGs, the Elder Scrolls family, kind of some of the older Fallouts, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas. Fallout 4 was all right. The story wasn't as great in my opinion, but still a well done game. And so I just have such a soft spot for role-playing games, more in the sense of, much like D&D, I can take on different personas, different ways of interacting with the environment. And I always love to be able to kind of step into a character and kind of explore what would the mindset of that character be, especially when I come up against conundrums of like, this is what the character would do, but me, Allison, would so not do this. So how do I reconcile this? Like, I remember my partner and I were actually discussing that something like that. We were in the, we were at his parents' house. His parents are already gone to bed. We were playing Fallout New Vegas, and there was like this decision point, and I was like, I don't know what I want to do. And he was like, do it. You should do that. You should do that. And I was like, I don't know. And eventually I went forward with the action, but his mom later was like, why were y'all arguing last night? It was like, no. This was a moral conundrum in gaming taking place. We are fine. The game environment's a different story.
Right. I was trying to find that one. There's one video about Senua's Sacrifice where it's people talking about how it impacted them. I cry every time every single time. I cry every time I watch it. But I don't remember what it's called, so I can't. I made myself a note over here. I'll find it later.
Please send that to me, because I have not seen that, and that would be an absolute delight. It's such a remarkable game.
Yes. Yep. It's I wish I could remember. It was set to a specific song, and it was like thanking the makers of the game, and it was talking about how people send in messages saying, I have not seen myself in a game before like this, and this is incredible. And it just like even
Yes.
talking about it gets me a little bit because
Right?
it was really touching, really incredible. I'll also send you
Mhm.
my favorite plant YouTuber.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And
Always looking for that.
yes, and he's like the realist about plants. He's like, if this happens to your plant, you need to just throw it out.
That is the type of plant person I
Yes.
need.
That's
I
absolutely.
give me the down low and the
Yes.
genuine knowledge. That is what I need right now.
Yep.
I will say there is another game, though not mental health related, but it is a gorgeous indie game, and I don't know how many folks know about it. What is it? Outer Wilds. It is a amazing game. It's basically you're on like a small planet, and you have basically this I guess kind of backyard spaceship. It's like made of wood and all of that, but it works. But it's like a tiny solar system, and so you're like going out from this planet, and the world around it is just full of mystery and puzzles. And there's like basically it's Groundhog Day where there is like this constant time loop, and you're having to constantly restart time. Very, very Mask of Majora, or Majora's Mask. I always get that mixed up, but wonderful game. And so it's one of like not necessarily mental health related, but if you want an amazing story and a really darn good puzzle, along with just visually spectacular, highly, highly recommend Outer Wilds.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. All right, let me look at some of these messages in chat here. So, okay, we talked about that one. Hey, Renee, how are you today? Welcome, welcome. One of my all-time faves is an 8-bit NES game, Dragon Warrior 3. There you go. Hey, Pyro, how are you today? Switchy asks, what is the most stigmatized part about your job in your opinion? That's a great question.
That is a phenomenal question. I guess like stigmatized in what sense? Of like me being a therapist, or more just like stigmatized in terms of like the mental health, folks experience? Just want to make sure I'm getting at what you're wanting.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's your profession, but I'll let Switchy weigh in with a clarification. Renee said I'm creating a TTRPG based on living with disabilities on supplemental security income and welfare benefits called Budgets and Benefits. Very cool. Based on my lived experience as a
Phenomenal.
disabled person with mental illness trying to make finances work on welfare. That sounds great.
That is phenomenal.
And
Best of
Switchy
luck
did
with
say profession indeed, but if you want to answer both sides, all good with me.
that. Great question. I would say in terms of stigma and mental health, especially if I think about stigma providers place on other providers, self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is a hot, hot, hot topic in the realms of mental health, in what is appropriate versus what is not appropriate, and so many schools of thought that have different beliefs about how self-disclosure can be used. I myself operate more from a multicultural, a bit of psychodynamic, a bit of a narrative-based approach. So a lot of my orientation at the core of it does have a degree of self-disclosure. One, to help balance power differentials, but two, to also foster authenticity and genuineness. And so I think that that is a huge stigma among mental health providers, that we have to be this, blank slate for folks to kind of, give their stuff to. And I don't agree with that. I personally believe that authentic human connection has a more profound impact on our own ability to grow, our own ability to feel stable, to feel comfortable with ourselves, with navigating the world. And that type of attachment necessitates a degree of self-disclosure. Now, there is very, very much appropriate versus inappropriate self-disclosure. You never self-disclose if you are disclosing for yourself as the provider. That's kind of a boundary you need to be aware of. But owning in the moment when I'm having an emotional reaction, whenever I feel joy or sadness or even hurt. And I definitely have had moments of feeling hurt by things that some folks have said, when those, internal defenses rise up to kind of protect that core, our center self. Being able to share that, to authentically acknowledge that reaction in the moment, it creates a human bond, a relationship, a level of rapport that I think the stoicism will never achieve. And also, especially as I think about my work with veterans, a population that experiences a lot of mistrust, very, very naturally, given, things that they may have experienced in the military, but also let us not forget, challenges of the history that is potentially a part of, the Department of Defense or the VA that may make these larger systemic barriers in place or may make people feel a bit hesitant to step into those environments. That these are huge things we have to be aware of. And I think a part of that also necessitates us as providers to be willing to be real. And I actually have such a memory from my mom. I remember whenever I was first starting out in this, I, was just so worried, so overwhelmed about what to say in the room, just so in my head about everything, and process a lot of this with my mom. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman. I love my mom. I will happily say that on air. But I remember her, and we were having this conversation. She was like, Allison, just be a person. Just be a human being in that room with them. And I remember there was one time I was in session with a woman who, very out of the blue, described a extraordinarily violent trauma. And it took me off guard. And I normally have like my own mental routine of like, I literally have mental plate armor in my mind where I'll put it on my plate armor, getting ready to go into some sessions, kind of safeguarding my own core. But my armor was not up and was not ready, and it all got taken in. And so I was just so overwhelmed and almost kind of panic in the moment of like, what do I say to this woman? And I just heard my mom's voice, Allison, just be with her. Just be a person. Because there is something in that realness.
Mm-hmm.
You can't fake it.
Right.
And whenever there is that realness in the room, it creates the safe environment for other folks to disclose. And especially as one of the big things needed in therapy is that willingness to be open, that willingness to be vulnerable. I think also in kind, we as providers sometimes have to model that for the folks that we are working with, and also being okay ourselves sitting in our own discomfort. That was a very long answer to that question. I got at it.
Well, Switchy said that was beautifully said. So there you go.
Okay, awesome.
Pyra said, as a survivor of multiple traumas, I just wanted to say thank you for showcasing this on this platform. It's important. It's really important to talk about this stuff. Renee said, I choose peer support specialist work so I could use self-disclosure, and authenticity is an important indication of integrity. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, so true. And also, thank you for the work in peer support. Peer support specialists are amazing, amazing human beings. I work so closely with so many of them. And one, I'm also just inspired of their own journey and where they have gotten to today to be at a place to be there for other people. I love the peer support specialists that I get to work with. And truly, they do not get enough credit in the field of mental health for the work that they do. I feel like very much them, social workers, especially boots on the ground in mental health. And God, thank y'all for y'all's work.
Yeah. So, does everyone who goes through something traumatic in their lives experience complex, co-occurring trauma symptoms and serious mental illness?
Question and no. Interestingly, in regards to trauma, the vast majority of us will experience some form of traumatic event across our lifetime. But the proportion of us that go on to develop PTSD is actually very small comparatively. Most of us naturally will experience some form of acute trauma symptoms. That will be where that hypervigilance will come into play. There will be those intrusive memories that will come into play, changes in our kind of mood, our thought process, changes in our general physicality. However, those are naturally occurring symptoms. Those are the body's way of digesting the experience of trying to make sense, to make meaning, to figure out if they're going to accommodate or assimilate that into kind of the concepts, the framework that we have within our own minds. PTSD comes into play whenever that process gets stalled out. And oftentimes the big culprit in that is avoidance. Avoidance is ultimately the biggest thing that ends up creating and maintaining PTSD. When we are not willing to engage with some of those memories, when we are trying to suppress them, whether it's, kind of pushing them down, distracting ourselves, using substances, engaging in reckless behavior, whatever that may be, to not experience that, ultimately it is keeping us in that space. It is keeping the power within the trauma because we are not allowing ourselves that space in a way to be able to process that experience, though processing the experience is indeed painful. But it is that avoidance that is often that culprit and how PTSD type of symptoms will end up developing. Now, also along those lines, not everybody that experiences trauma will go on to experience PTSD. Many folks will potentially present more with depression-based symptoms. Some folks will even go on to experience other forms of anxiety, panic, maybe even OCD. And for some, trauma can also elicit more serious mental illness symptoms. Trauma, especially as I think about, kind of co-occurrence between trauma and especially schizophrenia spectrum, they are so heavily tied. But the challenge often is, especially for folks who are experiencing serious mental illness, not many providers feel capable or able to treat both sides of that coin. A lot of folks will feel really equipped for the serious mental illness, but may not feel equipped for the trauma. And a lot of trauma providers have a stigma that those with serious mental illness will not respond to trauma-based treatments, which is unequivocally false. Is it more challenging? Yes. Is it potentially a slower journey? Yes. Will they benefit? Yes. So much yes. And also in the sense of there are so many different ways in which folks can recover, that just because somebody can't do what we call the gold standards of trauma treatment, which are prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, just because somebody can't, doesn't want to or cannot at that moment in time engage in either of those treatments does not mean that they cannot recover from trauma, cannot recover from, PTSD. There are a lot of different avenues that folks can experience that growth that don't have to be, that straight up path. And I use that path because I oftentimes think about recovery as climbing a mountain, and in the sense of there are a lot of different paths that we can take. We can definitely take that low path where it's a bit lighter, it's a bit easier on us, but we're still making our way up. For some folks, taking that black diamond hill is the way that they want to go, and that may be a bit more of that prolonged exposure where you're really confronting that trauma-based memory. You're exposing yourself to it by recounting it, repeatedly for a longer period of time, and then processing that experience with a provider. So there's a lot of different avenues that recovery can go. And so it's one where, you know, not everybody will go on to experience these things, and also not everybody will go on to experience these things as co-occurring.
Hmm.
There are definitely times where, PTSD, depression, anxiety can come up just as its single self. A lot of times they are coupled and like to go hand in hand. A big reason I think for that, especially between depression and PTSD, is one whole section of PTSD related symptoms are also mirroring depression symptoms. So even within how they are diagnosed, there is a tremendous amount of overlap, which
Hmm.
I have my own platform and soapbox that we don't have to get into necessarily on that. But it is one where it definitely can make it really muddy of how folks are experiencing their own kind of, trauma-related response, and also what that journey of recovery may look like.
Yeah. Switchy said, I was diagnosed with DID in 2018 and am specifically curious why there's such a stigma around the DID disorder amongst professionals, and asking if you have an opinion or view on this. And also said, sorry if I asked too many questions. You're not asking too many questions. No. It's all good. Please continue.
Yeah, these are great questions. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I will acknowledge, yes, there is so stigma around DID. I also think it's hard to name what the culprits are. I think some of the biggest challenges, especially in the sense of, I think about my own training. Most training programs don't provide instruction on how to help that. It is also, it is oftentimes one where many folks will not come into contact with it. Training programs will not incorporate it into, their respective programming. And that I think is to the detriment of the field because we are overlooking a very, very, impactful, potentially really serious experience that is so disrupting and oftentimes so scary for folks to experience. It is one where for myself, there is kind of a subgroup of like, kind of mental health population that does focus on, that based work, really trying to kind of emphasize destigmatization. I think another challenge is also, and this I think is historically something that mental health has had to brush up against, is um, media portrayals of these types of experiences. I think of the movie Split in particular, where though a entertaining movie creates a very stigmatized picture of what somebody with DID may be experiencing. And so it's one where I think that, especially with DID, it is also oftentimes less researched, which also further makes it challenging. It's also very sadly oftentimes less funded, which further perpetuates a lack of research within this area. It's one of those, like, very sadly, I think the list goes on and on of things that are impacting the stigma against DID. And that also, I think, is why in various realms, there's a greater push for this to be something that providers are more aware of. For myself, I actually started to get familiar with this whenever I was at a training specifically for accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy. Which is a therapy based approach created by Diana Fosha. Wonderful approach. It's extraordinarily connected with, kind of a more of a love and kindness perspective. It is really based a lot within attachment theory and relational based theory. And so a lot of that, especially, in the realm of DID, it is assisting with kind of the strengthening of like the center self. And also, I apologize if my language is also correct in this. I will acknowledge not my area of full expertise, but kind of that strengthening of that core self, a potential integration of the alters, and being able to kind of help with a reintegration of the personalities. And so from more of a dynamic perspective, there has actually been a lot more work within the psychodynamic realm with this. And also, personal plug out there, I also know that psychodynamic therapy also has a lot of stigma of Freud and laying on a couch and talking about your mom. Modern psychodynamic psychotherapy is not at all like that nowadays. Freudian theory, there are indeed some folks out there, but more of the modern forms of psychodynamic do not necessarily pull from those types of theories. So, and a lot of that psychodynamic work is really based in kind of that relational, aspect, based in more of that attachment theory. So that's my plug. Oh, and also it has a strong base of evidence, though other folks in mental health will disagree. But if you do any type of Google Scholar search, there are evidence out there for it. But truly, from more of that psychodynamic side of things, that is where I've seen more and more people being willing to, step into that space and to be willing to, assist folks who are experiencing DID.
And I would also highly recommend, there was I'll find the highlight for you, Switchy, but we did a stream with Victor Jansen, who is an advocate in Canada, and he is diagnosed with DID. He talked extensively about his own experience, his experience with the Canadian system. I don't know where you're located, but and how he's working to change and some of his recommendations for change also. So if you're interested in that, I can find that highlight for you, because it was a really good conversation, and I think that it will resonate with you, especially talking about the stigma around the disorder in general, in the mental health realm, for sure.
Would you mind sending that to me as well? I would
Sure, yeah,
love
absolutely.
especially to see recommendations because
Hmm.
it's one of, I know for myself, it's one of, you only can know so much, and I don't want that to be an excuse. So it's always why I've like, if I can find
Yeah.
new information, please let me bring that into my knowledge
Yes.
because it's meeting people where they are at because that
Hmm.
is ultimately what matters. being able to see each and every person for who they are, not just this label that has been slapped on them, but more really understanding that whole person. And also for myself, rounding myself out in areas of knowledge and acknowledging areas of, blind spots, areas of privilege, being aware of just all of that.
Yeah, and it was again, he is someone who was diagnosed with DID and then became an advocate and has worked with, trying to get change in the Canadian government. So might not be as applicable in the US, but it was a fantastic conversation. I'll send it in the chat here, and I'll send it to you also.
Awesome.
Let me
Yeah,
grab
quite a
that
different
link.
healthcare system.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. Quite different. Let me grab this link real quick. Okay, and I've added it right underneath the YouTube link to send to you after this. So what do you do or say to try to impart to clients who come to you after a traumatic experience with the question, what good can possibly come of this?
You know, I read that question and I was like, oh Lord, that is a great, great question. Because I do feel like a lot of it is tailored to the person, but oftentimes there's kind of a couple ways I find myself going about it. Like one, I look for those areas of their life that they're missing, that they're longing for, that they feel like is no longer there. And then I get explore with them like, why do you want that? What does that mean to you? What is that, what purpose, what meaning does that, impart unto you? Why do you want that? Okay. And so with what you're experiencing right now, is it getting in the way of this? Do you agree with what's going on? Do you disagree with it? Maybe a little bit of both? Because I think there is kind of within that exploring kind of almost our own like position on this experience. Because it's one of a lot of times, like when folks come into me, it's definitely kind of that question has been posed to me. And then it's also kind of in part there can be at times, depending on the person, if I feel like they're able, a bit of sarcasm or irreverence of like, well, you came to me, so you tell me. No, and that's a very rare occurrence. And it's normally after like I feel comfortable with the person. But there is in that sense of like, something got them to walk through the door,
Mm-hmm.
even if they are, told by their partner or told by their parents to go to mental health and go seek this. Something still got them potentially through that door. Well, I don't want my partner to be mad at me. Okay, so you value your partner. All right. So how is the PTSD getting in the way of your relationship with your partner? Okay, so let's explore that. So what thoughts does the PTSD try to get you to believe about yourself? What are the effects? What are the practices of the PTSD in your life? And I also am really intentional in saying the PTSD, the depression, the anything. That's really from me, from my kind of more narrative therapy based approach in the sense of you are not your disorder. The disorder is something you may be experiencing, but it is not you necessarily. And so by being able to differentiate what is our true core self versus what is the, experience we are having trying to get us to believe, that can be one way to start to kind of parse out, okay, well, maybe I don't fully agree with the PTSD. Maybe I don't fully want to stand for how I act whenever the PTSD has a hold of me. And that can allow us for that space to start to explore how this could be beneficial. I think there's also in my heart, though I never say it, there is also the thought sometimes of like, well, what do you got to lose?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is in the sense of like, well, you've kind of mentioned all of these things have been really challenging. I hear this longing, this desire for connectedness, for, a sense of stability, for a sense of safety, for the ability to trust. So, can we both acknowledge that this is scary, that this may feel really overwhelming, and that in this moment, we are having to trust. We are having to take that leap of faith, even if it's just we're going to dip our toe into that for the moment. That's all right. That is still a win. And I believe in that because I think having those conversations It's one where I think there are a lot of times whenever folks pose that question that there can very easily be the label of, well, they're being willful, they're being resistant, that gets slapped onto folks. But the thing is that willfulness and resistance are our defenses trying to protect us, that something doesn't feel safe just yet. Something doesn't feel like we can really step into that space right now. And that's all right. That is just letting us know that that is where we are at this moment. And so I try really hard not to see that question as that resistance or that willfulness, but more of that fear, that uncertainty of what this may look like, because it is. It is an uncertainty. And especially if folks feel as though they are not on a path, that they have fallen off the path that they are on, that they could no longer find that middle ground. Oh my God, of course those are going to come up to try and protect you in that moment. Of course you're going to have those thoughts and those questions and those uncertainties. It is natural that those are going to come up. And that is why I think exploring those, talking about those, not stigmatizing that is so incredibly important. And that's where I think for myself, a lot of times there can be, I think, this push from a system of like, okay, well, you have 12 sessions with this person. You need to be actively treatment focused. And if you're not doing X, Y, and Z, and you're not having outcome-based measures, then you are not doing proper therapy. I personally struggle with that school of thought because I think it takes away a tremendous amount of potential from what the therapy experience can be. And for some folks, I work with several folks who I have had the good fortune to get to work with them through my internship and through my postdoc fellowship. Um, and being able to have a year and a half with these folks where we were able to really be able to do that type of long-term based work and allow for those defenses to settle, allow for those defenses and maybe even that inner self to take me in, to take in this experience as something that is safe and trusting and genuine, something that you feel respected by. Sometimes that takes time. That oftentimes, for some folks, that may take your 12 sessions to get them to that place. And in my opinion, that can be all right. But I think it is one of figuring out for folks of where is that coming up? Where are folks needing? And also, I think there's also, especially with trauma, the delicate balance of not colluding with avoidance, because that can also be something that is coming up is that avoidance. The avoidance may be the voice that is coming through right now that maybe is feeling like, no, that's really going to be uncomfortable and scary. I don't want to deal with that. Let's just pull ourselves back on in. And of course, that is what the avoidance wants you to do. It wants you to pull back on into that space. So I think it is kind of this. I feel like I'm constantly doing a dance in therapy of just kind of, if I need to switch gears, cool, we switch gears. And also at the same time, I think for myself, just being mindful of what may be taking place and also sometimes asking, observing, noticing, seeing what may be transpiring.
Yeah. We have been here for an hour, so everyone remember to take a little drink of water.
Hydration, always important.
Yep, it is important, and I will forget to do it if I don't have a reminder in my chat telling me to do it. So there's that. Switchy says, do clients have flashbacks during a session sometimes, and how do you deal with those situations?
I have had a few moments where, like the content or the memory kind of becomes so visceral that it turns into a bit of a flashback in that moment. For me, it's one where ultimately my biggest thing in that moment is helping them to ground into the present. A lot of times with many folks that I work with, especially folks who maybe do experience more flashbacks, do experience more dissociative experiences, I do find that grounding and mindfulness space skills can be particularly helpful. So a lot of times in my office, I also always have something I'm fidgeting with. So I will always have a grounding object available. So if folks are struggling, with their consent, I will kind of place this in their hand and kind of walk them through, kind of noticing the sensation, grounding into that, leading them potentially through kind of that deep breathing exercise. And for some folks, it is a bit of writing it out, letting them know that they are not alone, that I am here with them, that they are safe, that they are here in my office. And I will give really concrete information of like, you are here at the Minneapolis VA. You are in this office right now. It is this date at this time. I am Dr. Allison Battles. I don't normally say the doctor. I normally just call myself Allison. Uh, Still getting used to that part. But really just kind of helping folks to kind of come back into this moment because whenever that memory takes over to that degree, it oftentimes is bringing forth kind of that panic-like sensation. And so that can also be a great avenue in the way of which, mindfulness and grounding has been shown to be so incredibly effective with panic-based symptoms. It also can translate extraordinarily well to, flashback-based experiences. And I imagine, maybe in some point in time have seen folks breathing in and out of the bag. May already know this, but the bag itself is not necessarily doing anything, but what it is doing is giving you that visual cue to slow your breathing down, to actually have it to be regulated. And so that's actually where kind of that brown bag technique, which I think we will maybe reach, will we ever reach a point where the brown bags are no longer a thing that generations know of? That makes me sad.
I don't
Um,
know.
I know, right? But that, all of those can be really, really beneficial things. And if you yourself find, that you are experiencing a flashback, those moments of kind of separating from reality start to set in, that is where I think having almost kind of like an arsenal with you of like these techniques, of these potentially even objects to help yourself ground. For some folks I work with who experience flashbacks, they'll kind of notice the onset, and one of them in particular will pull out his phone and he has videos of his kids. And his kids are an incredible grounding thing for him. And especially whenever like thoughts of suicide get extraordinarily high, that the videos of his kids, hearing their laughs, seeing their faces, seeing their smiles, that helps him kind of center into that moment, center into kind of to what is happening around him rather than what that flashback or where that panic may be taking him.
Yeah. So what you said, it sounds like you're a blessing to the clients you have. I agree.
Oh,
Definitely.
thank y'all. I it is one, I am not immune from burnout, but that is why self-care is so important. But I also love what I do. Like I especially say this now, at the end of all of my graduate stuff, now having a job. But it is, I am so excited by the work that I get to do. And also I feel really privileged in what I get to do. Because therapy is not easy for folks to come in and to be vulnerable and that folks are willing to open up, to trust me and to, that I can provide that space for them. That brings me more joy than I can say. Really does.
Yep. Coyote says, when I'm talking to a therapist office or my insurance company to make an appointment for long-term care, is there a term for that? And what are some questions I should ask to get good outpatient long-term care? So kind of generally, if you're trying to get long-term care, is there something that you can ask in the moment?
Good question. So, one of the challenges, especially with long-term based care, is our insurance system. The vast majority of insurance companies are going to be restricting folks to a certain number of sessions over the course of the year, which makes long-term care a privilege for those who can afford provider fees. Now, a lot of providers have sliding scales where they're able to work with folks of various income levels to be able to help, but I want to acknowledge that that is a very, very real socioeconomic barrier
Yeah.
to being able to access that degree of resource. I will say in terms of, and this is also where I struggle with also giving this feedback, in the sense of providers that do tend to engage in more long-term based work, psychodynamic therapists in particular do tend to operate more from that longer term lens. Especially there is one therapy approach called time-limited dynamic psychotherapy, where it's in the range of 18 to 24 sessions. So it's still a longer period of time, but even advocating for that can be really challenging with insurance companies, especially since a lot of the insurance companies want folks to get cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Uh, it's all right. CBT's fine. CBT's fine. I don't have opinions on that. But it is. I acknowledge that it is very, very hard. So it's one of like, I think it is in a sense for that longer term work, it is also trying to figure out what you're wanting to achieve with that. If it's one where you are seeking that stable place of attachment, stable place of support, it could be one where engaging in peer support groups, engaging with a peer support specialist that may be available. I know some medical centers will have it. Private practices don't tend to have peer support specialists as much. Community organizations may have those available, but those potentially maybe folks depending upon the nature of the work, how the organization itself is operating. I know at our VA we have something called the Compassionate Contact Corps, which is a group of highly trained volunteers who provide more of that long-term supportive based care. And so that is something that is available to folks, but it is keeping more in that realm of kind of that peer support model. Um, so that's where it's one of, that is definitely an option. But I also will acknowledge, as kind of going back to that psychodynamic realm, is that also, especially given those long-term based approaches, some psychodynamic providers may not even take insurance. So that is definitely something to kind of also be mindful of, kind of keep in mind, because there are, in terms of like specific therapy approaches that go for longer, it's really variable. Like there are like acceptance and commitment therapy could be one where it could be a very structured, very kind of tailored approach where you're in that realm of like 12 to 14 sessions. It can also be done very flexibly, where there is a bit more of that leeway to have a bit more of that longer term base care. So it's a lot of the provider, the resources that are available, and then also just respective need. Because one of the things we as providers also want to be mindful of, and I struggle with this word, but I don't have a better word, is we don't want to foster dependency. It is more in the sense of part of the process, and this is also, I think, a challenge with in the sense of therapy is I think a lot of times we will have this notion that we have to get to the destination, that the final destination is when therapy ends. But the challenge is that sometimes life, circumstances, resources don't allow for that. And so sometimes as providers, our goal may be to get folks on a path so that they have a sense of direction, they have a sense of their own self, their own values, and so they are able to, being on that path, continue the work themselves and continuing moving forward. We want to foster that agency. We want to foster that empowerment. And at the same time, I personally don't want to kick anybody to the curb too soon. So it is kind of that balance in things of kind of how I think especially our more American based mental health care system is kind of looking at therapy these days. So a really jumbled answer. I hope that's helpful.
I mean, listen, I in the US, I've been going to therapy for multiple years, and when I first started trying to go to therapy, it was hard. It was hard to figure things out. It was hard to figure things out. What was covered, what wasn't covered, what portion of it was covered, what was covered through my employer, what was covered outside of my employer, what was covered under insurance, what part of it. It was ridiculous. And what I wound up doing is I called, fortunately, I work for a company who has an employee assistance program. I called them and I was just like, I don't understand. I don't get this. So tell me what I need. Like literally just tell me what the next step is. And I was able to get help that way. But man, in the US at least, it's a crock. It really is so difficult for something that is so important. And when you're already in a place of need for this kind of service where you don't want to have to deal with that, that's when you have to deal with it. So
exactly.
It's a crock.
It really can be. And that is why I'm also so thankful for those organizations out there that provide those types of free services, that provide the national call lines in those moments of crisis. Because it is no lie, very hard to get hooked up in the system. I mean, I think, at the VA where we are as close to a universal healthcare system as we get in the US at this moment in time. But also the barriers that veterans face getting into here, getting connected to benefits, getting connected from primary care to mental health to this, that, and the other, and just the process that it takes, and how exhausting that is. And also, no wonder why, whenever folks get to you and you feel safe and you feel stable, my God, why would you not want to hold on to that person for the rest
Mm-hmm.
of your
Yeah.
life? And that's why, for me, it's one, especially now being able to stay, with supervisor approval, would love to leave an open door for some of my folks of like, hey, while we're not going to be able to work together each week because I'm moving to an entirely separate team, I still want for my door to be able to be open where if you need me, you call me. We have a 15, 30-minute check-in where we're able to provide that stable place of attachment for you to feel, secure again so that you can go forth and back out into your life and keep on keeping on. Because oftentimes whenever folks come in for those check-in, yeah, there's that moment of crisis, but also a lot of what I'm hearing is all the coping, all the different things they've already been doing, and they are doing it. And so half of that conversation is also me being like, you are doing it. Look at all the work that you are doing. And if there are areas of struggle, cool. Let's figure that out. Let's process, let's brainstorm.
Yeah, absolutely. Coyote said that was helpful. So there you go.
Good.
Renee says there's some real re-traumatization issues inherent in the insurance model. Medicaid, yeah, absolutely. And that's another reason I created the budgets and benefits game to use in advocacy and show how many
I
problems there
love
are
that
in
name.
welfare system. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So how do you go about working with a client to facilitate their healing and growth after a trauma?
That's a great question because I think there's a lot of different ways in which we can go about things. For me, a lot of times it will start with that kind of whether it's, an initial assessment, especially if I'm the first person they are seeing on our team. We oftentimes will do a more kind of formal intake process where we're getting a sense of what they're experiencing. But once folks enter into my therapy room, we're just having real human conversations to start things out. Where are folks struggling? What are their strengths? What are their, areas where they feel like they're really good at? Where are areas that they feel like they need to grow from? What are their access to resources? What is their cultural identity? How is that integrated into their experience, into their life? And it's from there that I try to tailor an individual treatment plan based upon all of these different factors. Because for me, that recovery oriented lens is so incredibly critical. We're not just treating the problem, we are treating the whole person. And a lot of that means addressing things like identity, hope, empowerment, just general being a person. What are the person's strengths? And so it's from there that I'll try and get a sense of how do they, kind of think about the world? How do they prefer to address their problems? Do they like to tackle it head on and just kind of barrel their way through? Is it one where maybe kind of a more gentle, approach to kind of get into things is more beneficial? Is somebody more up in their head or is somebody more of a heart person? Where are they? Are they a head person that needs to get connected with their heart? Are they a heart person that maybe needs a bit of the balance of the mind? All of these things will kind of come into play with me in terms of how I'm going to tailor my treatment plans. And so for some, depending upon what they're experiencing, it may be one where those more kind of gold standard classic, trauma-based approaches like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, those may be great for them, especially if there's somebody that likes things concrete. They want things to be really tangible for them. They want to be able to see potentially rapid progress and are willing, especially for prolonged exposure sometimes, willing to sit with that discomfort and also willing, I hate this word, to do the homework. Because both of those therapy approaches necessitate quite a bit of outside-based work. And that is integral in those therapy approaches. That is oftentimes why prolonged exposure can be effective in as little as 6 sessions. Because if folks are able to, and I use the word able because it can be a very intensive experience, and I want to fully acknowledge that. And so it's one for folks who are able to do that. They have potentially the coping skills at their disposal to be able to do that. Great. That is one avenue that we can definitely go. For other folks, especially if they find themselves experiencing multiple traumas across their life, potentially traumas that have compounded into what is being experienced today, for them, it may be one of kind of taking on a different lens. I also will use acceptance and commitment therapy and narrative therapy in for treatment of trauma, especially because both of those. So for ACT, that kind of acronym for acceptance and commitment, ACT is a great model in the sense of it is a incredibly flexible approach where you're able to kind of utilize this model of like different places of mindfulness, acceptance, willingness, values, committed action. You're able to kind of look at this larger model and kind of ping around to all these different places to where you may be going. I find, especially for folks who have experienced trauma, that value-based work can be incredibly impactful in kickstarting that journey of recovery. Because it allows folks to be able to start to recenter into themselves, to start to re-explore what things matter to them. And similarly with narrative therapy, that is all about kind of looking at these stories that we have in our minds about our life, about the problem that may be happening, and how are we, focusing on those stories, how much of the story gets what degree of emphasis. Because oftentimes it can feel as though trauma becomes the chapter of our book that we read and reread and reread, and we never feel like we get to move on to the next chapter. And so with narrative, we're looking at those stories, we're looking at those levels of meaning making to be able to start to explore what could be that preferred narrative. What are the other things on the path that you are on that maybe you are not seeing just yet? How can we take that step back from the PTSD, the trauma, to really take in all of the other things in your life around you? And so for those approaches, it is one where we have a way more just flexible conversation, allowing for kind of whatever comes up for folks to kind of guide where we are going, but then being able to kind of integrate in these principles, these techniques into those conversations so that the conversations take on a different flavor, a different degree. I personally love narrative therapy. It is a principle-based approach and is actually one that is not necessarily an evidence-based approach, more in the sense of a lot of those within the field of narrative therapy disagree with the medical model and how things have been conducted. So there's less research on it. There is some that is coming out, but it is a incredibly beneficial approach, and one where folks at the VA that I'm at are doing research on it, and it is so incredibly needed because it is allowing for conversations to happen in a way that is taking the trauma from being them to being the trauma and being able to explore the different meanings of that, but more specifically, getting folks to recount stories of moments when they were engaging in that preferred experience rather than potentially stories of that problem. So we're thickening that experience of those more preferred based narratives. So there's a lot of different ways folks can go about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a one size fits all. It's kind of to the individual a little bit.
Very much so.
Coyote said, I noticed that venting my normal weekly stress to someone helps cut down on episodes, but it's not nice to dump that on a friend. So you mentioned group counseling. Is it okay to vent in those? And Renee did respond and said adding a weekly support group meeting that felt right for me was really helpful, that's great feedback, kind of on a what worked for you kind of thing, for sure.
Yeah. I think for the support, I mean, for the group side of things, it is one where it depends upon the group. Some groups may have elements of being a trauma-based group. Oftentimes, trauma processing tends to be best in more of an individual therapy experience because even for trauma-based groups, a lot of times they're trauma education, trauma coping groups where they're oftentimes teaching skills rather than allowing for, or rather than more of that processing, especially in the sense of for group members discussing trauma can be something that can be incredibly activating for folks. And oftentimes in a group experience, facilitators are wanting to keep people kind of in that optimal learning zone, that optimal mindset to allow them to be able and to stay in that group experience. So that is why I found like trauma processing groups not to be per se as frequent. That is not to say that, groups do not have those types of conversation. And there are indeed process-based groups that allow for kind of exploration, especially, kind of exploration of in the moment experiences of how folks are interacting, how folks are relating to one another. But I oftentimes find it in the sense of like a trauma-based process group. I have not run into those as often, especially more in the sense of that potential activation risk. So it's one of, I think in the sense of, one, I'm thrilled you have a friend that you are able to disclose that to, and I also hear the care you have for that friend and not wanting to feel as though kind of that sensation of dumping. So it could be one of, potentially looking into some individual-based care to have that space to process. And it's also one where I also will put a plug out there that there's also phenomenal online therapy now, with so many different organizations that are doing fantastic clinical work, that there are kind of a greater variety of how therapy can be conducted nowadays.
Yeah, and I'll also add, even though the command is not working right now, but there's also peer support forums that if you're just needing to get something off your chest and you don't want to either pay for therapy because it's not covered by your insurance, or you just kind of need to get it out there and you don't want to burden someone over and over, you can always go to something like the forum at Heart Support, which I put in there, and you can put a trigger warning on it, say that, this might be triggering, and then just get it out, get it onto the screen, get it out. There's a text line. Like I said, I don't know why the command isn't working, but it's not. So sad, but there's things like that too. So if it's something, a matter of funding that you can't, it's one of those things that's available online for free too.
I also like that you bring that up because I think that is also why oftentimes folks will advocate for journaling, because being able to stream of consciousness, just word vomited out onto the page,
Yes,
can be really helpful for kind of being able to have kind of that immediate release. And then potentially you could kind of follow up maybe with a friend of like, hey, I was processing a bit of this. I've done some of this, but I still have a little more. I want, just some space for. Are you willing to just be here for me? And I think it's also a big part of checking in with the friend. Is this something they are in the mindset to, be able to be there for? Kind of checking in with where is their well-being in that day. Because that also just, really reflects that care and respect, and, really kind of that care and respect that I'm also hearing and even asking that question.
Yep. And I have a couple friends who will reach out to each other and say, hey, do you have just time and space for me to word vomit at you for a little bit? And most of the time, the people who I will ask that and who will ask me that, the answer is almost always yes. Like that's the thing, is that if you're at that level with someone, it's almost always going to be yes.
Exactly.
Renee said you can search for peer respite and peer support in your area, and sometimes spaces locally as well as virtual. I have a friend who shared a Google Doc with, and I will sometimes go and trauma dump. They know they can read and respond when it's right for them. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's really cool. I would wind up forgetting that it was there, but that's my brain issue, not anyone else's. I want to go back to something that Switchy asked that I missed earlier. She said, what do you guys write down on the notepads that you have?
I don't use a notepad. I feel the notepad takes me out of the moment from with my clients. And oftentimes I find with the notepad, I am not as present with people. I am not as authentic with people. So I don't use a notepad anymore. I will use a notepad whenever I'm actually conducting assessments and I need to take down the detailed information that you're providing, but otherwise I don't want really there to be anything between us. Now, that being said, I have, definitely with a bit of my play orientation in there. There are definitely, figurines, grounding objects, this, that, and the other that may get integrated into things, but those are used more as kind of further connecting or deepening agents rather than the notepad. I don't like the notepad because, don't like the notepad.
Yeah. And I will say that I have asked my personal therapist, what are you writing down on that notepad over there? Whenever we were seeing each other in person, like I would see her writing stuff down. And she showed me her notepad, and it was literally just, hey, don't forget to send this to her. Don't forget to do this. She was just writing herself notes like, don't forget you owe her this worksheet. Don't forget you owe her this paper. Don't forget to send her this link. Like, that's what she was writing down.
Mm-hmm. And I also think, in a lot of ways, if the notepad is bringing up that anxiety, and this is somebody you're working with at individual therapy, ask.
Yeah.
Because if that is something that is impacting your feeling of safety and trust with that person, it's going to be really hard to open up and get to that deeper healing work.
Yeah, absolutely. So you describe your passion as expanding perspectives on different avenues of growth. What does that mean to someone who isn't an expert on trauma recovery?
Good question. So what that means is that, I think that, expanding those opportunities for growth is in a lot of sense how I also interact with other providers. Because as providers, we can oftentimes find ourselves getting into a rut of only doing what we know. And I think that is potentially to our detriment in the sense of we overlook ways that we can be advancing things to be able to meet people where they are at in a more effective manner. So for myself, especially as I think about, ways in which I have tried to do that, like integrating in narrative therapy is one where it is a less known therapy approach. It is a principle-based approach. So many providers are like, well, it doesn't have an evidence base, so it's not really a thing. But that's just it. There is growing evidence. There is also, tremendous progress that I have personally experienced in my own practice doing this type of approach. And so it's one where, for me, I try and stay really mindful, really flexible in the therapy approaches I am learning and trying to integrate, because ultimately I want to be able to have a massive toolbox to be able to kind of be like, all right, so these are my core foundations of what I operate within. These are the other things I am proficient in. Let's figure out how we can utilize this to meet you where you're at. And if that means taking more of that integrative approach, where we're bringing in a little bit of this, a little bit of that, to be able to kind of create this amalgamation of two evidence-based approaches, and it's meeting people where they're at in a way that neither would have originally, why would we not want to start to look into things like that, to look into those new opportunities for growth? I actually think the pandemic has been an interesting experience in the sense of it has definitely kind of turned some notions of mental health on its head, in the sense of we must be in the therapy room with people in order to actually, feel their emotions, to see their nonverbals. Am really great at reading faces now. I am also really great at picking up intonation of voices. Telehealth can be a huge benefit for some people. For many folks that I work with who experience serious mental illness, telehealth has been a godsend, because getting into the hospital was one of the biggest barriers for them to actually engage in care. And now we're able to do this from their own home. I'm also able to get a sense of how their quality of life is doing on video, how their apartment is looking. All right. So like, where are you at right now? How are things going? I'm seeing things look a little bit more cluttered. How's the disorganization going? So there can be benefits in that way to these types of advancements. And so for me, especially as I, kind of think about, that passion of, expanding those perspectives, it is one, things like this where I get to talk about other types of modalities, other ways for folks to engage in treatment. And I also do similarly, at the medical center that I work in, by doing various talks around the medical center, consulting with various providers on these different types of treatment approaches, and for myself doing program evaluation research of these types of new advancements that we're coming up with.
So we are at an hour and a half. I just want to check in with you, see how you're feeling, make sure you're good to continue through these.
I am probably about 2 questions left.
Okay.
I will acknowledge
right.
I got a wee bit of an early morning tomorrow.
That's why I was checking in. So I think we'll wrap up with a couple here, but and then I know we've got a couple more in chat. So
Awesome.
Some of them are pretty short and sweet. So at what point do you decide that geek content and culture would be supportive to the therapeutic environment? And have you ever had anyone balk at that?
Um, so in terms of like when I will integrate that in, a lot of time it's when folks express interest. When I hear a little like, side comment, a little inside joke, a little, thing here or there, that'll start to get to explore that. It is also something in my assessments whenever folks first come in to the clinic. I am very intentional about asking about leisure activities. What are folks' strengths? What are they engaging in? And if I start to get indicators that some of that geek and gaming realm is within there, we explore that a bit more and kind of find that there are ways in which to integrate that in. And so for me, like in individual therapy, various metaphors that get used in that imagery based exercises that may be done. I've even done full D&D character creation in individual therapy where folks are able to create like this character sheet for an ideal self, a shadow self, like all of the, these different parts. And so it's one of, kind of keeping my ears open, keeping my radar up. And another part is just asking if that is something they're interested in and if that's something they feel like is meaningful. Because I think a big thing in the geek and gaming content is also what is an activity versus identity. Because it is more in that realm of when we start to get into identity that we really can integrate that into therapy in a far more meaningful way. Whereas if we're talking about an activity, then we're kind of thinking about, all right, is it healthy behavior, unhealthy behavior? Is this something that we need to kind of think about moderating? Is this something that maybe engaging in different types of games would be more beneficial? Um, Now, in terms of people balking at it, I have actually been really fortunate in the sense of I have actually not had many veterans balk at this notion. I did a talk with on this and with one of our cancer support groups. And it was with a group of, older veterans. And I was so expecting for all of them to be like, that's just ridiculous. This is just nonsense. Having to check my own stigmas right there. And so, ended up going into that, and they all were like, "Oh yeah, my grandkids played this, and I watched them play this, and they try to explain it to me. I don't understand a thing about Minecraft, but they seem to be having a good time." And so it is interesting in the sense that I have had less people balk at it because I think more and more people are slowly coming around to the idea that play is profoundly impactful. And I also have kind of started to see a shift in the sense of I think folks are tired of not acknowledging that play is fun. I think folks are kind of tired. I think there is a degree of exhaustion of adulting that I am slowly starting to see. And especially in the sense of like, I'm loving it with providers because I have actually had so many providers be like, would you be willing to run a provider D&D therapy group? And I'm like, D&D group? Yes. Therapy? No. And so but I love it because it's one of like so many, and especially I'm always shocked whenever the medical doctors and the psychiatrists are like, I need you to run this for me, please. I'm like, yes, if you would come to this, I would happily run it for you because I think there is this shift in the sense. I don't think it's everywhere. I think I've been very, very fortunate in the environment that I've been in to receive the type of support that I have. But also, whenever if there is that type of balking, it's normally just like, oh, okay. So what do you find interesting? And just kind
Yeah,
of rolling with it,
right.
rather than seeing it as that resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bite Mark asks, what is your favorite poem?
My gosh. I don't know if I have one. I feel like that sounds horrible, but like I can't, oh my
It's not
gosh, I feel like
horrible at all.
it's one of those like I will acknowledge like I wasn't really as big into poetry whenever I was
Hmm.
growing up, so I can't fully bring a specific poem to mind. But I love that question and I wish I could give a more thoughtful response to
Do you have
that.
a
Oh
favorite
my God.
book or piece of literature or anything?
I
Oh,
actually take that back. I do have a poem, and my partner walking through the room reminded me of it. We have a poem that we read at our wedding, and now for the life of me, I cannot remember the name of it. Um, but it is a poem that basically is speaking about love and marriage, more in the sense of, two independent spirits agreeing to walk this journey and this path together, never to own, never to bind, never to restrict, but always to support and cherish and walk this path together. And there was something so profound because we are extreme, it is important for us for there to be equity within our
Mhm.
relationship. And so the poem embodied that because the last thing that we wanted was for me to be his property or for him to be my property, but for us to be that team uh, that we in our hearts know that we are. So I hate that I can't remember that poet's name. It's one of those like, this will be the thing I will share with you all. I
Okay,
will send you the
perfect.
poem for that.
Perfect.
Because that comes to mind. And thanks, honey, for popping out. Uh,
It sounds a lot like the Celtic wedding vows. Those are very equality based, and those were great. That's what we used in my marriage. So they were fantastic. And then Fiona asks, "What is your day-to-day experience like as a therapist, and what was your experience like while you were in school to become one?"
All right, that's a different ballgame. I will say my day-to-day as a therapist these days, on average, on a super heavy day, I will see probably about, 6 people. In the day, a lot of times within that, there is always the cursed note writing. I despise note writing, but it is a necessity of the job. So there's a lot of times in the range of 4 to 6 clients within a given day. Oftentimes a lot of, team meetings, consultations, note writing, follow-ups. Um, I'm also, involved within training of, other, young psychologists. So there is also, for me, especially as a postdoctoral fellow, there is both supervision of receiving supervision and giving supervision. So that is also another big part of my day. The receiving of supervision will go away, and hopefully, giving of supervision will get to increase more. And with those days, it could be any range of there may be individuals that I'm seeing, and maybe a couple that I'm seeing, or I may be doing group therapy. I try and kind of keep my days balanced in the sense of if I have a group one day, I'm going to keep myself a bit lighter on my individuals and my couples versus other days where if I'm heavy on, individuals and things, I'm not going to be doing a big group. Graduate school is a whole other ballgame. I mean, there truly is no other way to say it. It was probably the worst 7 years of my life, in the sense of grad school is brutal.
Yeah.
And more in the sense of it wasn't the work. It wasn't, the information was too hard or the tests were too hard. It was the sheer amount of everything. Because in clinical psychology, not only are you attending your classes, you're doing research. You're also a clinician. So you are, out in the community doing therapy-based work. You are doing research and attempting to get published. You're trying to, do presentations out there. You're working on your thesis. You're working on your dissertation. You're also oftentimes managing different research studies or labs for your research mentors. I also served as a teaching assistant, so taught several classes. I also served as a graduate coordinator, so helped other graduate students with organizing kind of their TA work. And that's not even to talk about the classes, which were truly the easiest part of everything. Um, I think another challenge of grad school is also the fact that there is a tremendous amount of breaking you down to nothing to build you back up. And it is a brutal process and a process of the field I do not agree with, which is why I have removed myself from academia. And in my own training and supervision, I am so intentional of fostering self-care and agency and their own empowerment because I know their graduate program is not likely doing that for them. And that is not to say, I had such some wonderful experiences in grad school. Would I change where I am now? Hell no. No. I am here and I'm so thrilled that I am. Was it a pain in the ass? Yes. Was it worth it in the end? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it really is. So it's one where it's like, yeah, grad school's a hard bag to really say what any day was aside from sheer chaos, tears, sweat, tears, and more tears.
Yep. Understandable.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll wrap up on this question, and this question is the one that we always ask, and this is the magic moment. So I have my magic wand here, and get it to where it's not gonna give anyone seizures. Come on, there we go. So this is the magic wand. I'm gonna wave it right here, and now you get to pick one thing to eliminate a common opinion, misconception, or theory surrounding mental illness, disabilities, or talking about mental health. And so, what are you going to eliminate today?
That vulnerability is weakness. I want to eliminate that because vulnerability is the most courageous thing that we can possibly do. We are authentically sharing ourselves, our true self. What there takes tremendous amounts of bravery to even step into that space, tremendous amounts of trust and willingness to step into that space. That is not cowardice, that is courage. That would be the biggest thing I would like to eliminate. Because also in the same vein of I have so many moments where I've seen folks just so scared to be vulnerable, so scared to open up. I find my core just wants to hug their core and just be like, it's okay. You are safe. You are loved no matter what you share. Because I have not heard a single thing to this day that I have been like, you are well, I have not heard a single thing to this day in my therapy experience. Let me rephrase that. That I have not thought you are an irredeemable person.
Yeah.
Even folks who have, experienced perpetration-based traumas, you are not a monster. You experienced something. You did what you had to do. You tried to make the best of the situation that was likely a no-win to begin with. And being able to step into that space to process that is incredibly courageous. So that would be my magic wish.
Listen, that's a perfect magic wish. Perfect. So I'll just open it up to you and say if there's anything that you want to throw out there as far as resources or sites or recommendations, something we didn't cover, I'll just hand the floor over to you. And while you're talking, I will post your socials again in the chat for everybody.
Awesome. So I think in terms of, just general mental health, the National Center for PTSD is a great organization in terms of getting foundational information about PTSD, trauma-related recovery. They do tend to align more with those gold standard-based approaches for individual PTSD-based care, but is a great resource, especially for folks who are trying to understand what is going on. NAMI is another wonderful organization, National Association of Mental Illness. Yes, I think so. Also a wonderful organization. I may be mispronouncing.
I think it's National Alliance of
Alliance. There we go.
Yes. But it is mental. I think it is mental illness. So.
Yeah. Also another wonderful organization with, good community-based resources. These are larger organizations. I will refrain from locals just because I have no idea if anybody's in Minneapolis, so I'll keep those to myself. But if anybody is in need of resources in the Minneapolis area, you are always happy to hit me up on Twitter, and I will happily send you the way of some wonderful, wonderful folks in this area. I think in terms of, therapy and gaming, I myself partner very closely with the folks over at Game to Grow. And so I have
love those folks.
Attended all of their trainings. They're phenomenal.
Yes.
And so, really it's one of like, if the therapeutically applied role-playing games is your jam, they are such a wonderful organization as well.
Yep. Absolutely. And so I popped those links in there. I got the ptsd.va.gov, the NAMI, and Game to Grow as well. And it's definitely one of those things that there's just so many resources out there. And if you are looking for something local, you can do some Google searches, but also you can always join the Discord. And there are so many different resources that we can connect you with too. And if you haven't checked out the interview with the Doctors Kilmer from Game to Grow, that's on here somewhere too. So you're welcome to check that out as well.
Awesome.
And they presented at Tags, if I'm not mistaken, so you can get that media pass, dang it.
Yeah, it's one of those get the media pass. We actually were together, so you get 3 for 1, all
There
wrapped
you
up in
go.
one talk.
Yep, there you go.
Yeah, and I'm actually thrilled to report that them, as well as Adam Davies and Dr. Megan Connell, we will all be presenting actually at the upcoming American Psychological Association. We have a symposia on therapeutically applied tabletop role-playing games that we are super pumped to be able to present on.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. Chat, give me just a couple minutes to disconnect offline, and I'll be back playing some Minion Masters, and it's been a week, so I'm sure I missed stuff in that community, and we'll have to catch up with it. But thank you so much for being here. Switchy says, thank you, a great stream, and Renee says, I have the media pass. Absolutely. So thank you for your time today, and just thank you for joining us and interacting with the community.
Of course. Thank you all for having me and for just your thoughtful questions. It was super fun to talk to you all today.
And that wraps up my conversation with Dr. Allison Battles. There were so many meaningful takeaways here, from the importance of hope in recovery to the reminder that healing isn't linear and doesn't look the same for everyone. Whether it's finding the courage to explore therapy, reconnecting with yourself, or simply taking small steps towards growth, there's always a way forward, even when it doesn't feel like it. One of my favorite parts of this conversation was how Allison talked about balancing self-care and mindful engagement. It's such a relatable reminder that the activities we love can help us recharge, but it's all about the how. Whether you're baking, gardening, or gaming, staying mindful of how you engage with those activities can make a real difference in your well-being. I also loved how Allison broke down the stigma around mental health providers being blank slates. That reminder to show up as your authentic self, whether you're a provider, a client, or just someone trying to navigate life, is something we can all take to heart. If this episode resonated with you, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment, send me a message, or share your thoughts on social media. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the podcast, and leave a quick review. Your support helps keep this space going and helps people find the podcast. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Remember, it's okay to take things one step at a time, and healing, whatever that looks like for you, is possible. Take care of yourself, stay connected, and I'll see you next time for another mental health conversation on Even Tacos Fall Apart.